The radio crackled with static, then silence. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Kane pressed his earpiece deeper, willing the connection to return. 300 meters below his sniper position, 6 Taliban fighters moved through the narrow Afghan canyon like shadows against limestone walls. His SEAL team had been tracking them for 18 hours through terrain that looked like Mars had been carved by angry gods. "Overwatch, this is Trident 6, Kane whispered into his throat mic. "Request immediate air support. 6 tangos moving toward the village." Nothing, not even static. Lieutenant Jackson Rodriguez crawled up beside him, dust caking his beard. "Comms are dead across all frequencies," he muttered. "Something's jamming us hard." Kane's jaw tightened as he watched the fighters disappear around a bend in the canyon. Intelligence had been tracking this cell for months. They'd been responsible for 3 IED attacks on supply convoys, killing 12 American soldiers and twice as many Afghan civilians. Today was supposed to end it. "Command said air cover was guaranteed," Rodriguez continued, checking his rifle scope. "2 Apache on station, F-18s 15 minutes out." "Well, they're not here now." Kane studied the canyon through his binoculars. The village of Kaladaka sat like a brown smudge against the valley floor, maybe 2,000 people living in mud brick houses that had stood for centuries. Women would be preparing evening meals, children playing in dusty streets, none of them knowing death was walking their way. "We could take them," Rodriguez suggested, but even he sounded uncertain. 6 targets, 4 SEALs, no extraction plan if things went sideways. The mathematics of war rarely favored heroes. Kane was about to respond when something made him look up. A sound that didn't belong, not the whistle of wind through rock formations, not the distant bleating of goats. Something mechanical, something angry. The Apache came out of nowhere, a mechanical wasp painted desert tan. Flying so low its rotor wash kicked up dust devils 50 feet behind it. The pilot was threading the helicopter through the canyon like a needle through cloth, main rotor blades clearing the cliff faces by mere yards. Rodriguez grabbed Kane's arm. "Jesus Christ, who's flying that thing?" The helicopter's nose dipped as it dove deeper into the canyon, disappearing behind an outcropping of rock. Seconds later, the distinctive whine of a 30 chain gun echoed off the canyon walls. Once, twice, 6 times. Then silence returned to the mountains. Kane stared at the empty sky where the Apache had vanished. In 15 years of special operations, he'd never seen flying like that. The canyon was barely wide enough for the helicopter's 70-foot rotor span. One mistake, one gust of mountain wind, and the pilot would paint the cliffsides red. "That wasn't on our flight manifest," Rodriguez said quietly. The radio suddenly burst to life. Any station, this is Viper 7-1. 6 tangos neutralized. Canyon is clear." The voice was calm, professional, and distinctly female. Major Elena Vasquez had been awake for 36 hours, but her hands remained steady on the Apache's collective and cyclic controls. The AH-64D responded to her touch like an extension of her will, every vibration through the airframe telling her stories about wind shear, rotor torque, and the razor-thin margin between life and death that defined low-level flight in mountainous terrain. "Good shooting, Viper 7-1, came the voice of her weapons systems officer, Captain David Park, seated behind her in the Apache's tandem cockpit. All 6 confirmed down. Elena pulled the helicopter into a climbing turn, her eyes constantly scanning the canyon walls. Flying this low required split-second decision-making. The mountains didn't forgive hesitation, and they certainly didn't forgive ego. But sometimes, when American lives hung in the balance, you did things that lived in the gray area between courage and stupidity. Her call sign hadn't always been Viper. For the first 8 years of her Army career, she'd been Bookworm, a nickname that followed her from flight school, where she'd studied tactical manuals while other pilots hit the officers' club. The name carried mockery wrapped in collegial humor. She was too serious, they said, too precise, too afraid to push the envelope. That changed 3 years ago in Syria. "Base, this is Viper 7-1, Alina transmitted as she guided the Apache out of the canyon. "Mission complete, RTB. "Viper 7-1 base, outstanding work. How did you know to be in that sector?" Alina's grip tightened almost imperceptibly on the controls. The truth was complicated. She'd been monitoring radio traffic when she caught fragments of the SEAL team's communications before the jamming started. Technically, she'd been ordered to patrol a different grid square. Technically, what she'd just done constituted insubordination. "Heard chatter about troops in contact," she replied, keeping her voice neutral. "Figured I'd take a look." A pause. "Copy that. See us when you land." Park shifted in his seat behind her. "Think Colonel Morrison's going to have words." Alina watched the Afghan landscape roll beneath them, endless browns and grays punctuated by the occasional green of a river valley. This was her second deployment to Afghanistan, her third to a combat zone. She'd learned that sometimes you had to choose between following orders and doing what was right. The army taught you to follow orders. Life taught you that sometimes orders were wrong. "Probably," she said, "but those SEALs are going home tonight." The words carried more weight than Park could know. Alina's older brother Miguel had been a Marine infantryman, killed by an IED in Iraq when she was still in college. She joined the army partly for him, partly for the simple belief that someone should stand between innocent people and those who wished them harm. Her Apache crested a ridgeline, and forward operating base Chapman spread below them like a small city of concrete barriers and canvas tents. Home, of sorts. Viper 7-1 tower, cleared direct to the flight line. "Colonel Morrison wants to see you immediately upon landing." Alina keyed her mic twice in acknowledgement, then focused on her approach. The Apache settled onto the dusty landing pad with the gentle precision that marked a pilot comfortable with her aircraft. As the rotor spooled down, Alina began running through her mental checklist of explanations. Colonel James Morrison had commanded the 4th Combat Aviation Brigade for 18 months, long enough to recognize both exceptional piloting and creative interpretation of orders. He stood in his office, hands clasped behind his back, watching Major Alina Vasquez through the window as she walked across the flight line toward headquarters. Even at a distance, her stride carried the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she'd done and why. "Enter," Morrison called when the knock came at his door. Alina stepped inside, removing her flight helmet and tucking it under her arm. Her dark hair was matted with sweat, and dust streaked her flight suit, but her posture remained ramrod straight. "Sir, Major Vasquez reporting as ordered." Morrison studied her for a long moment. At 48, he'd seen enough combat pilots to recognize the rare ones, those who combined technical skill with the kind of situational awareness that kept people alive. Vasquez was definitely rare. She was also becoming a problem. "Major, you were assigned to patrol Grid Square Bravo 7. You engaged targets in Grid Square Delta 2. Care to explain?" Alina met his gaze directly. "I intercepted radio communications indicating American forces were in contact with enemy personnel. I assessed the situation and determined immediate action was required." "You intercepted communications." Morrison's voice carried no inflection. "Communications that were being jammed." "Yes, sir. I caught fragments before the jamming became effective." Morrison walked to his desk, picking up a tablet computer. "I have 6 confirmed enemy KIA in a canyon that our intelligence people said was impossible to fly through. I also have a SEAL team that's alive because someone provided close air support when their communications were compromised." He set the tablet down. "What I don't have is a pilot who followed her assigned mission parameters." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. "Major, in 12 minutes I have a call with General Patterson at Bagram. He's going to want to know why one of his helicopter pilots decided to freelance through what our topographical surveys classify as non-navigable terrain for rotary-wing aircraft. Alina's jaw tightened slightly. Sir, the terrain was challenging but manageable with proper technique. Manageable, Morrison almost smiled. Major, I've been flying helicopters for 22 years. I wouldn't attempt what you did today even with perfect weather and unlimited fuel. He moved to the window again, looking out at the flight line where maintenance crews were inspecting Alina's Apache. The helicopter showed no signs of damage, no bent antennas, no scraped belly panels, nothing to indicate its pilot had just threaded it through a canyon like a giant, armed needle. Your tactics instructor at Fort Rucker called you bookworm, Morrison continued. Said you flew by the manual, never took risks, always played it safe. Alina's expression didn't change, but Morrison caught the slight tightening around her eyes. Funny how people change, he said quietly. What happened in Syria, Major? The question hung in the air like smoke from distant fires. The memories of Syria came back in fragments, the way traumatic events always did. Alina could still smell the cordite and burning diesel fuel, could still feel the Apache bucking beneath her as she fought to maintain control with hydraulics failing and warning lights painting her cockpit red. Syria was different, sir, she said carefully. Morrison nodded toward the chair across from his desk. Sit down, Major. This isn't about protocol anymore. Alina hesitated, then settled into the chair, her helmet balanced on her knees. Through the window, she could see mechanics performing their post-flight inspection on her Apache, their movements methodical and thorough. She trusted those mechanics with her life every time she climbed into the cockpit. 3 years ago, you were Captain Vasquez, flying escort missions for supply convoys, Morrison continued. Solid pilot by the book, no complaints. Then you volunteered for a search and rescue mission near Aleppo. Alina's grip tightened on her helmet. She remembered that day with crystalline clarity, the kind of memory that came with nearly dying. 2 Marines were down behind enemy lines, she said. Their helicopter had been hit by an RPG. The original rescue package was grounded due to weather. Morrison pulled up a file on his tablet. According to the after-action report, you flew through a sandstorm with 0 visibility to extract those Marines. Your co-pilot submitted a recommendation for the Distinguished Flying Cross. Captain Reynolds was generous in his assessment. Captain Reynolds said you flew for 20 minutes using nothing but instruments and intuition through the worst conditions he'd ever experienced. Morrison's voice carried a note of respect. He also said that after you pulled those Marines out of a building that was taking small arms fire, you changed, became more aggressive in your tactical approach. Alina stared at her reflection in the dark computer screen on Morrison's desk. Aggressive. The word carried implications that made her uncomfortable. She'd never thought of herself as aggressive. Determined, maybe. Willing to do what was necessary. Sometimes the book doesn't have answers for what you encounter in the field, she said. And sometimes pilots start thinking they're invincible because they survived one impossible mission. Morrison's voice carried a warning. I've seen it before, Major. Good pilots who push their luck once too often. Alina met his gaze. Sir, with respect, what I did today wasn't about pushing luck. It was about saving lives. By violating direct orders and flying through terrain that could have killed you and Captain Park. The words carried the weight of command responsibility. Morrison was thinking about his pilots, his aircraft, his mission. Alina understood that. She also understood that sometimes you had to weigh individual safety against collective good. The SEALs are alive, she said simply. Morrison sighed and closed the tablet. The call with General Patterson lasted 17 minutes. Alina sat in the outer office, listening to the muffled rise and fall of voices through the colonel's closed door. Twice, Morrison's voice rose above conversational level. Once, She heard her name spoken clearly enough to recognize it through the walls. Master Sergeant Williams, Morrison's senior enlisted advisor, sat behind his desk typing reports and pretending not to notice Alina's presence. Williams had been in the Army for 24 years, long enough to recognize the particular kind of tension that surrounded pilots who'd done something spectacular and problematic at the same time. The door opened and Morrison appeared. "Major, join us." Alina stepped into the office to find Colonel Morrison holding his secure phone, the red light indicating an active encrypted connection. "General Patterson, Major Alina Vasquez." The general's voice came through the speaker with the crisp authority of a career officer who'd risen through the ranks during 2 decades of continuous war. "Major, I understand you provided close air support to a SEAL team today." "Yes, sir. I also understand you did so by flying through a canyon that our terrain analysis software flagged as impassable for Apache-class aircraft." Alina felt Morrison's eyes on her. "Sir, the terrain presented challenges, but I maintained safe flight parameters throughout the mission." A pause. When Patterson spoke again, his voice carried what might have been amusement. "Major, I have a preliminary report from the SEAL team commander. Chief Kane says he's never seen helicopter flying like that in 15 years of special operations. He used the phrase physics-defying in his initial debrief." "I'm familiar with the Apache's flight envelope, sir." Apparently more familiar than Boeing's engineers thought possible. Patterson's voice became more serious. "Major, I have 2 problems. First, you violated direct orders by leaving your assigned patrol area. Second, you accomplished a mission that our planning staff said was impossible." Alina waited. In her experience, generals rarely called to deliver simple reprimands. "However," Patterson continued, "I also have 6 fewer Taliban fighters who won't be placing IEDs on roads traveled by American servicemen. I have a SEAL team that's going home to their families instead of being shipped home in flag-draped boxes." Morrison was watching Alina carefully, his expression unreadable. "Major, I'm told your call sign used to be Bookworm." "Yes, sir." "What do they call you now?" Alina's throat felt dry. "Viper, sir." "Viper?" Patterson seemed to consider the name. "Major, effective immediately, you're being assigned to a Special Operations Aviation Unit. You'll receive new orders within 24 hours. Alina felt the world shift slightly. Special operations meant different rules, higher stakes, missions that existed in classified shadows. "Sir, I'm honored, but I'm committed to my current unit." "Major," Patterson's voice carried finality, "this isn't a request." The canyon felt different in daylight. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Kane stood at the same overlook position he'd occupied 18 hours earlier, but now he was studying the terrain with different eyes. The limestone walls that had seemed like natural barriers in the darkness revealed a complex geography of ledges, outcroppings, and wind patterns that would challenge even the most skilled pilot. Lieutenant Rodriguez crouched beside him, using binoculars to examine the canyon floor where 6 bodies still lay scattered among the rocks. 60-foot rotor span, Rodriguez murmured, lowering his binoculars. "Canyons may be 70 feet at the widest point." Kane nodded. He'd been thinking about the Apache pilot since yesterday's engagement. The voice on the radio had been calm, professional, controlled. No hint of the adrenaline that should have accompanied threading a multi-million-dollar helicopter through terrain that looked like it had been designed to kill aircraft. "Found something," called Petty Officer Second Class Tommy Washington from a position 30 meters down the ridgeline. Washington was their communications specialist, a tech-savvy kid from Detroit who could make radios work in conditions that defeated everyone else. Kane and Rodriguez made their way to Washington's position, where the younger SEAL was kneeling beside a collection of electronic equipment, partially hidden among the rocks. "Jamming device," Washington explained, pointing to a metal case connected to what looked like a car battery. Chinese manufacture, but the configuration is Iranian. They've been using these to block our communications during ambushes. Kane studied the equipment. How long was it active? Based on the battery drain, maybe 6 hours. Started jamming just before dawn, right when those fighters moved into position. Rodriguez shook his head. So this was planned. They knew we were tracking them. Gets worse, Washington continued. This frequency range would have blocked not just our comms, but aircraft communications too. That Apache pilot shouldn't have been able to coordinate with anyone. Kane felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She flew that mission completely autonomous. No ground control, no weather updates, no backup, Rodriguez added. Just her and whatever intelligence she could gather from visual reconnaissance. Kane looked back toward the canyon, trying to imagine the pilot's perspective during yesterday's engagement. Flying through narrow terrain without communication support, making split-second decisions about target identification and engagement parameters. The level of skill required was almost incomprehensible. "Chief," Washington said quietly, "I monitored the air traffic frequencies after the jamming stopped. That Apache's call sign is Viper 71. Kane knew that call sign. Every special operations unit in Afghanistan maintained informal databases on aviation assets, pilots who could be trusted to show up when things went bad. Viper 71 had a reputation. Elena Vasquez, Kane said, heard stories about her from the guys in Syria. What kind of stories? Rodriguez asked. Kane was quiet for a moment, remembering conversations in forward operating bases and aircraft hangars. Stories that sounded too incredible to be true until you met someone who'd been there. The kind you don't believe until something like yesterday happens, he finally said. As they prepared to leave their observation post, Kane took one last look at the canyon. Somewhere in his mental database of debts owed and favors given, he filed away the name Elena Vasquez. Elena's new orders arrived via secure courier at 6:30 hours, exactly 24 hours after her conversation with General Patterson. The sealed envelope bore the distinctive markings of classified material, and her name was typed in the block letters that characterized military bureaucracy. She opened the envelope in her quarters, a 10 by 12-foot concrete box that she'd called home for 8 months. The orders were brief, typed on official letterhead that bore no unit designation, no location identifier, nothing that would indicate where she was being assigned or what she'd be doing. Report to Building 47, Bagram Airfield, NLT 1400 hours, 15 March for in processing with Special Operations Aviation Regiment. Bring only personal items and flight equipment. All other belongings will be shipped separately. Elena read the orders twice, then set them on her small desk. Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the 160th, was legendary within Army aviation circles. The Night Stalkers, pilots who flew missions that didn't appear in official records, supporting operations that existed in the classified margins of American foreign policy. She'd applied for the 160th twice during her career, both times being told she lacked the necessary experience for special operations aviation. Apparently, threading an Apache through an Afghan canyon had changed that assessment. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Ma'am, Colonel Morrison wants to see you." Elena found Morrison in the operations center, standing before a large digital display showing aircraft positions across Afghanistan. Red icons represented active missions. Blue icons showed aircraft in transit or on standby. One blue icon near the Pakistani border bore the identifier V-71, her Apache from yesterday's mission. "Major, I've been reviewing your personnel file," Morrison said without turning around. "Graduated second in your flight school class, distinguished graduate from the aviation captain's career course, master's degree in aeronautical engineering from Embry-Riddle. Alina remained at attention. Yes, sir. Morrison finally turned to face her. 8 years of active duty, 3 combat deployments, 0 accidents, 0 incidents. He paused. Until Syria. Alina's jaw tightened slightly. Sir, the Syria incident was investigated and closed. No pilot error was found. No, Morrison agreed. In fact, the investigation concluded that your actions saved 2 Marines who would have died without immediate medical evacuation. It also noted that you flew through conditions that grounded every other aircraft in the theater. Morrison walked to his desk and picked up a folder. What the investigation didn't note was that, after Syria, your flight characteristics changed. You started taking missions other pilots wouldn't touch. Started pushing aircraft performance envelopes that made maintenance chiefs nervous. Alina remained silent. Your weapons systems officer from Syria, Captain Reynolds, put in his report that after that mission, you seemed to understand something about flying that you hadn't understood before. He said it was like watching someone discover they had capabilities they'd never known existed. Morrison opened the folder, revealing what Alina recognized as her flight evaluation reports from the past 3 years. Consistently rated as one of the top Apache pilots in theater, but also noted for aggressive tactical approach and willingness to accept risk levels that exceed standard parameters. Alina finally spoke. Sir, I've never compromised safety or mission effectiveness. No, you haven't, which is what makes you either very lucky or very skilled. Morrison closed the folder. The Night Stalkers think you're very skilled. The words carried implications that Alina was still processing. The 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment represented the pinnacle of Army helicopter aviation. Pilots who could put aircraft precisely where they needed to be, when they needed to be there, regardless of weather, enemy action, or terrain that would challenge the capabilities of both machine and operator. Sir, I'm honored by their interest. Morrison smiled slightly. Major, they don't operate on interest. They operate on capability, and apparently, yesterday convinced them you have capabilities they need. Alina felt the weight of transition settling around her like dust from rotor wash. In 6 hours, she'd be leaving everything familiar for an assignment that would redefine her understanding of what military aviation could accomplish. Any advice, sir? Morrison considered the question. The Night Stalkers have a motto, death waits in the dark. They mean it literally. You'll be flying missions where failure isn't just professional embarrassment, it's American lives lost and national security compromised. He extended his hand. Don't let the pressure change who you are as a pilot, Major. They recruited Alina Vasquez, not someone trying to prove she belongs. Alina shook his hand, feeling the firmness of a commander who understood both the burden and the privilege of military aviation. Thank you for the opportunity, sir. Morrison watched her leave, knowing he'd just lost one of his best pilots to an organization that would ask more of her than he ever could. He also knew she was ready for it. In the Afghan mountains, readiness was often the only thing standing between mission success and catastrophe. Bagram Airfield stretched across the Afghan landscape like a small American city transplanted into Central Asian dust. Alina drove through the main gate in a government vehicle, showing her orders to guards who barely glanced at the paperwork before waving her through. At Bagram, everyone was going somewhere classified. Building 47 sat in a restricted section of the airfield, separated from normal traffic by concrete barriers and additional security checkpoints. The structure itself was unremarkable, a single-story concrete building that could have housed administrative offices or maintenance facilities. Only the lack of windows and the sophisticated antenna arrays on the roof hinted at its true purpose. Alina parked and gathered her flight bag, the same battered canvas satchel she'd carried through 3 deployments. Inside were her flight helmet, survival equipment, personal weapons, and a few photographs that reminded her why she'd chosen military aviation as a career. Miguel's picture occupied the place of honor in the zippered pocket closest to her heart. Major Vasquez. The voice belonged to a tall man in unmarked fatigues, his bearing unmistakably military despite the absence of rank insignia or name tape. "I'm Chief Warrant Officer Jake Thompson, 160th SOAR. Welcome to the dark side." Thompson led her through a maze of corridors that seemed designed to confuse visitors. The walls were lined with photographs of aircraft and aircrew, but Alina noticed something distinctive about the images. Many showed helicopters in impossible positions, landing on building rooftops, hovering in confined spaces, flying through weather that should have grounded any rational pilot. "Night stalkers," Thompson explained, noticing her attention to the photographs. "We specialize in missions other people consider impossible." They stopped before a door marked only with a number, 12. Thompson knocked once and entered without waiting for a response. The room contained 6 people seated around a conference table, all wearing the same unmarked fatigues as Thompson. At the head of the table sat a woman Alina judged to be in her early 40s, with graying hair and the kind of weathered complexion that came from years of flying in harsh environments. Major Vasquez, Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes, Commanding Officer, 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment Airborne. Hayes's voice carried authority earned through experience rather than granted by rank. "Please, sit down." Alina took the indicated chair, setting her flight bag beside her feet. She was conscious of being evaluated by every person in the room, their assessments invisible but nevertheless thorough. "Major, your canyon flight yesterday has generated considerable interest in special operations circles," Hayes began. "We've reviewed the terrain analysis, interviewed the SEAL team you supported, and examined the flight path reconstruction from your Apache's data recorder." Hayes opened a laptop computer and turned the screen toward Alina. The display showed a 3-dimensional representation of the canyon, with a red line indicating her flight path. The visualization made clear how narrow the margins had been, rotor blades clearing rock faces by mere yards, altitude changes measured in feet rather than the hundreds of feet typically maintained for safety. "This flight profile indicates pilot capabilities we typically see only after extensive special operations training," Hayes continued. "Yet according to your records, you've had no exposure to our training programs." Alina studied the visualization, remembering the feeling of the Apache responding to minute control inputs as she'd guided it through the canyon. "Ma'am, I've always been comfortable flying in confined spaces." "Comfortable?" Hayes seemed amused by the understatement. "Major, what you accomplished yesterday requires a combination of spatial awareness, aircraft control, and tactical judgment that we spend months developing in our pilots." One of the other officers, a major wearing pilot wings, leaned forward. "Where did you learn to fly like that?" Alina considered the question. The honest answer was that she wasn't sure. Ever since Syria, flying had felt different, more intuitive, as if her connection to the aircraft had become more direct and immediate. "Trial and error, sir. Combat tends to teach lessons quickly." Hayes nodded approvingly. "Major, the 160th operates under different parameters than conventional aviation units. We fly missions where success depends on capabilities that exist at the extreme edge of what's possible with current aircraft and training." Alina felt the weight of evaluation settling around her. This conversation would determine whether she joined an elite organization or returned to conventional aviation assignments. "We're offering you a position with Task Force Brown," Hayes continued. "Deep reconnaissance and direct action support for special operations forces throughout Afghanistan and adjacent areas." Alina met Hayes's gaze directly. "What kind of missions, ma'am?" "The kind that don't appear in official records, Major. the kind where failure isn't an option. The words carried implications that Alina was still processing when Hayes stood, indicating the briefing was over. Report to flight operations at 500 tomorrow. Your training begins immediately. Alina's quarters in the 160th compound were identical to military housing throughout Afghanistan. Concrete walls, basic furnishings, a narrow window that looked out on aircraft parking areas where helicopters sat like sleeping mechanical insects. What made these quarters different was the view. Instead of conventional Apache and Blackhawks, the flight line held aircraft configured for special operations. She recognized the distinctive profiles of MH-60 Blackhawks with aerial refueling probes and advanced sensor packages, MH-47 Chinooks modified for long-range insertion missions, and AS-6 little birds that looked like weaponized toys beside their larger cousins. These were aircraft designed for missions that pushed the boundaries of what helicopters could accomplish. Alina unpacked her few possessions, arranging them in the same configuration she'd maintained in every duty station throughout her career. Photographs on the desk, flight manuals on the shelf beside her bed, personal weapons secured in the wall locker. The routine of organization helped establish continuity in an environment where everything else was changing. A knock at her door interrupted her unpacking. "Ma'am, Chief Thompson, mind if I come in?" Thompson entered carrying 2 cups of coffee and a manila folder. He settled into the room's single chair, gesturing for Alina to sit on the bed. "First night in a new unit always sucks," he said, offering her one of the coffee cups. "Figured you might want some company and a briefing on what you've gotten yourself into." Alina accepted the coffee gratefully. "I'm starting to wonder if I've made a mistake." Thompson laughed. "Everyone wonders that the first week. Hell, I've been with the 160th for 8 years and I still wonder sometimes." He opened the manila folder. "But then I remember why we do this job." The folder contained mission photographs, helicopters landing on mountain peaks, aircraft hovering beside ships in rough seas, formations flying through weather that looked like the inside of a blender. Each image represented capabilities that seemed to defy both physics and common sense. "We call ourselves Night Stalkers because we specialize in missions other people won't attempt," Thompson continued. "Flying at night, in bad weather, into places where aircraft aren't supposed to operate." Alina studied a photograph showing an MH-60 hovering in a canyon barely wider than its rotor span. "How do you train for something like this?" "Carefully, and with the understanding that mistakes tend to be fatal." Thompson's voice carried the weight of experience earned in dangerous places. "But the payoff is that when American lives depend on aircraft being exactly where they need to be, we can make that happen." Alina set down her coffee cup. "What kind of missions will I be flying?" Thompson's expression became more serious. "Reconnaissance deep in enemy territory, direct action support for SEAL teams and Delta Force, personnel recovery in places where conventional search and rescue can't operate." He paused. "Sometimes things that don't have official names or mission classifications." The implications were clear. Alina would be flying missions that existed in the classified margins of American foreign policy, supporting operations that would never appear in public records or congressional reports. "Any regrets?" Thompson asked. Alina looked out her window at the special operations aircraft, sitting under floodlights like technological predators waiting for nightfall. "Ask me in 6 months." Thompson stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Major, there's something else you should know. Word about your canyon flight has spread beyond military circles. Intelligence sources indicate that enemy forces are specifically looking for the pilot they're calling Ghost 71. Alina felt a chill. "They know my call sign. They know someone with unusual capabilities is operating in their area. That makes you a high-value target." Thompson's voice carried warning. "Just something to keep in mind during mission planning." After Thompson left, Alina stood at her window watching maintenance crews work on the aircraft. Somewhere in the darkness beyond Bagram's perimeter, enemy forces were planning operations designed to kill American servicemen. Tomorrow, she'd begin training to stop them. The stakes had never been higher. Flight operations for the 160th occupied a building designed to function 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Alina arrived at 500 to find the facility already bustling with aircrew, maintenance personnel, and intelligence officers preparing for missions that would launch before dawn. Chief Thompson met her at the entrance, carrying flight equipment and looking like he'd been awake for hours. "Morning, Major. Ready for your first flight evaluation." Alina nodded, accepting the helmet and body armor Thompson offered. The equipment felt familiar despite bearing the distinctive markings of Special Operations Aviation. "Today we're flying with Captain Lisa Park, one of our instructor pilots," Thompson continued as they walked toward the flight line. "She'll evaluate your basic flying skills and spatial awareness." The aircraft waiting for them was an MH-60M Blackhawk, but Alina immediately noticed modifications that distinguished it from conventional helicopters. Extended-range fuel tanks, sophisticated sensor packages, and defensive systems that spoke to missions flown in hostile territory. Captain Park stood beside the aircraft, conducting her pre-flight inspection with methodical precision. Alina judged her to be in her early 30s, with the confident bearing that came from thousands of hours flying in dangerous environments. "Major Vasquez, welcome to Task Force Brown," Park said, extending her hand. "Heard about your canyon flight. Impressive work." "Thank you, ma'am." Park gestured toward the helicopter. "Today we're going to evaluate your ability to operate in the kind of terrain and conditions where we typically conduct missions. Mountain flying, confined area landings, formation flight in degraded visibility." Alina felt familiar pre-flight anticipation building as she completed her own inspection of the aircraft. Every helicopter was different, with its own quirks and characteristics that pilots learned through experience. "One question," Park said as they prepared to board. "Your file indicates you've never flown MH-60s. Any concerns about transitioning from Apache to Blackhawk?" Alina considered the question. The aircraft were different in significant ways: size, weight, flight characteristics, mission profiles. But at their core, they were both helicopters governed by the same principles of aerodynamics and physics. "Aircraft systems are different, but the fundamentals are the same," she replied. "I'm a quick learner." Park smiled. "We'll see about that." The first hour of flight evaluation covered basic skills: hovering, auto-rotations, emergency procedures, navigation. Alina felt the MH-60 respond to her control inputs, learning the helicopter's personality through subtle feedback transmitted through the controls. "Not bad for your first time in a -60, Park commented through the intercom as Alina completed a series of hovering maneuvers. "Ready for something more challenging?" Alina keyed her mic twice in acknowledgement, then followed Park's directions toward a mountain range that rose like broken teeth from the Afghan landscape. The terrain ahead looked like it had been designed specifically to challenge helicopter pilots. "We're going to practice confined area landings," Park explained. "Landing zones barely larger than the aircraft, surrounded by obstacles, requiring precision that leaves no margin for error." Alina felt